Hey there. First of all, allow me to beg your pardon for having taken so long to actually follow through with what I said I would do, which is essentially to provide a general introduction to Foucault, particularly as his theories relate to sociology. Give me a minute here, I've got to get my camera set up correctly. And what I've decided to do is to take this project in stages. Otherwise, it's simply too significant a task to. I mean, I could sit here and talk for 3 hours and not really make a dent in what I feel like needs to be said. I think there's very little doubt that in the late 60s and early 70s, actually into the 80s, Foucault was by far the most influential intellectual, I don't want to say philosopher, right? But intellectual certainly in Europe, if not in the world. The reason I hesitate to say philosopher is because Foucault himself rejected that term when he was initiated into his chair at the College of France. He in fact refused the chair of philosophy. He renamed it chair of the history of systems of thought. And to read his works is very clear that they're quite syncretic. Well, they're quite hybrid in nature. They're not straightforwardly philosophical, right? They're not Derridian in any way. I mean, Derrida does philosophy. He applies philosophy to various different fields, but he's a philosopher. Althusser, right? Althusser is dealing with Marxism, but very particularly as a form of political philosophy, which ideally can be transformed into praxis, and so forth and so on. Before I go on to talk about Foucault's specific works, let me say something about his training and his background. Prior to the onset, prior to Levi-Strauss's introduction of structuralism, the philosophical curriculum in France was very positivistic, and very Kantian. In general, one was either a philosopher of science or one was a Kantian. In Foucault's case, he was the former. He was a philosopher of science primarily. Indeed, Georges Canguilhem, who wrote the fantastic book, The Normal and the Pathological, was one of Foucault's. He helped to oversee the writing of Foucault's thesis, which we finally have in its full form, have for some years now, The History of Madness. And the History of Madness, while it certainly breaks from any sort of positivistic mold, betrays his training in the sciences. Indeed, Foucault was in France. You do both your major thesis and you do a minor thesis, and his minor thesis was actually on an existential psychologist, Ludwig Biswanger, and Foucault trained in a psychiatric institution. there's been a tremendous amount of debate, rather silly as far as I can see, particularly among historians, for example, as to whether or not Foucault classified as a historian. Absolutely, yeah, he does. There's no doubt that Foucault is a meticulous historian. Indeed, in his very famous essay, Nietzsche, Genealogy and History, he opens with the phrase that, to the effect that the genealogist deals not in the light and the sunshine, but instead in the depths with texts that haven't, with musty, moldy texts that haven't been examined in decades, centuries even. Foucault prodigiously used very old manuscripts, original manuscripts, as his source material. In fact, I can't recall a single instance in which Foucault uses any sort of contemporary work as a source, even a minor source. That's not to say, of course, that he's not influenced by contemporary work, only that he doesn't feel compelled to deal with it in any sort of head-on fashion, right? He does not. Foucault very specifically did not engage in polemics. Although Foucault was indeed trained primarily in a positivistic approach to the history of or to philosophy of science, another one of his great influences was Gaston Bachelard, who was a fantastic philosopher of science. He invented the notion of the episteme, the epistemic break, which is essentially a precursor to Thomas Kuhn's notion of the paradigm and the paradigm shift, right? Bachelard argues that there are points in history when dramatic discoveries lead to, as it were, a sort of falling out of the ground, of falling out of from under the feet of scientists, of the ground of their work. I think of the CERN experiment of 5 or 6 years ago, when these poor physicists actually went public with the idea, with what they believed was proof that the very basis of all modern physics had been denied when, I believe it was 6 protons arrived, having been shot off from a pardon my brain here not functioning correctly, having been sent from one superconductor, a superconductor in I believe it was France, to one in CERN, Switzerland. What they said was that these 6 protons arrived nanoseconds prior to the rest of them. The essential assertion was that they broke the speed of light. This is the cosmological constant. According to Einstein, it's impossible for anything to exist beyond the speed of light, right? Had the CERN experiment been something that could have been duplicated, we would have had the epistemic break of all times. it would have been rather fascinating, right? I mean, the entire edifice of modern physics would have absolutely exploded and crumpled. I was actually hoping that it could be duplicated, because it would have been absolutely fascinating to see how one reconstitutes from the ground up, a discipline that's so essential to our assumptions about the world and how we live. But that's a digression, and I'll go ahead and admit to the fact that I'm rather fond of digressions. I hope that I can keep them to a tolerable minimum. Throughout history, there have been epistemic breaks, and Bachelard established this notion, made it quite. I mean, it's accepted at this point. Made it quite famous, and it had a significant influence upon Foucault. Foucault will not talk. Well, okay. Let's see how to put this. He actually will refer to the episteme, right? But more significantly, he talks in terms of discourse, right? Of discursive transformations, of transformations in the way in which people speak and write about particular facets of our social fabric. And after all, this is primarily what he deals with, right? Foucault makes the most significant break for Foucault is that between what he calls the classical age and modernity. We can generally understand the